This is Jeffrey Crivero, and with me is Dr. Connie Lester, and I'm conducting an oral history with Annie Gavin. The interview is being conducted at the Antioch Missionary Baptist Church Community Center in Oviedo, Florida, on Tuesday, January 27th, 2025. Ms. Gavin, thank you so much for speaking with us today. Would you please begin by telling us a bit about what life was like for you growing up?
Okay, first of all, it's Dr. Gavin.
Dr. Gavin, okay.
Life growing up in Oviedo was very simple. It was a rural life in all respects. Houses were not very close together. We had dirt roads. The street on which I lived did not have a name at the time. The area was called Jackson Heights because mostly Jacksons lived there. I was one of 10 siblings. My father was an only child. So it took on the name of my grandfather, who homesteaded the land since 1910. So it was basically the Jacksons and the Moores. The Moores lived even further back than we did in wooded areas, and they had a lot of children. So it was basically the Jacksons and the Moores back there for years and years and years. We were pretty sheltered for the most part. Our social lives basically consisted of church and school. And when you were not at church, not at school, you were working basically with your parents on their farms or in their gardens. Most people had gardens. And at the time when I was growing up, all of us had outdoor toilets. We played softball in the dirt in our yards, usually with sticks or with boards because we didn't have baseball bats as such. We rode our bikes. Usually there was maybe one bike per family, and you rode your bike or walked wherever we went. We walked to church, which was maybe a little over a mile until my dad got a car. And so that's what it was like. Everybody knew everybody else. We didn't have keys. Nobody locked their doors at the time. We were in and out of other people's homes all of the time, but your parents always knew where you were, and you were always home before dark. That was one of the rules. You could go play, but you had to be home by dark. And that's basically what it was like. I walked to school in the old location before Jackson Heights Elementary was built, and it was initially Oviedo Elementary after we moved from the original site, which was across the street from Fountainhead Baptist Church. Then when the new site moved to Jackson Heights, I basically just walked across the dirt road to get to school. And that was from grade 1, because we didn't have kindergarten at the time, from grade 1 through 8. And then in 9th grade, we were bused to Crooms Academy High School, which was in Sanford, Florida, 17 miles away, one way. After that, I went to college. And the rest, as they say, is history.
What were your parents' names?
My mother was Lucille Williams Jackson. Her father was a minister. As a matter of fact, he was one of the first ministers at Grant Chapel AME Church, which is still an active church here in Oviedo. My father, who was an only child, was Moses Elijah Jackson. He was the only son of Henry and Althea Jackson, my grandfather.
And were they also from Central Florida?
No, my grandmother was from northern Florida, but my grandfather was from Georgia.
Do you remember some of your favorite memories from school? Did you have a favorite teacher?
I think my favorite teacher was probably Mrs. May Frances Muller, who was the music teacher and was the wife of the principal, Stanley Muller, who was principal at that school for more than 20-some years, 27 or 28 years, 20-something years. He was the only principal that I ever had at that school, Oviedo Elementary, going to Jackson Heights Elementary, going to Jackson Heights Middle School, which it is currently.
And what were some of your favorite things about your community?
I guess the fact that everybody knew everybody. Teachers went to the same churches that we did. They lived in the same communities that we did. So they were really interested in us both in school and out of school. They shopped at the same stores. We were made to feel welcome in their homes. So I guess the fact that it was a small community and a closely knitted community was one of the things that sticks with me, you know, and one of the things that I miss, because as you become more urban, you lose those special things about small communities.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that one of the biggest differences nowadays in the community?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's more urban. People, there are a lot of people who did not grow up here. A lot of transplants, and that's good in some ways, but in other ways, people who come from communities where they don't really greet each other and speak to each other makes a difference. People who would rather look in the opposite direction as opposed to speak to you. That was not what we grew up with. You know, people would speak to you even if they didn't know you.
What do you hope that the Oviedo Colored School Museum will bring to the community?
I hope it will bring factual history. Our history in particular, history of Black children in America. My personal feeling, and from what I see, is that the history is being distorted. It was not all pleasant. There was some ugliness. And I see attempts to erase or pretend that it never happened. And I don't think a community can grow and move forward unless you accept all of what's in your past. So I think that the museum will have an opportunity to not necessarily try to relive anything, but to give a true picture of what growing up in Oviedo and going to colored schools was like. Because you have to have a conversation. If it was a colored school, why was that necessary in the first place? It was a colored school because you couldn't go to the white schools. And that's something that I think a lot of people want to deny that ever happened in this country. It happened in this country. We had colored schools because our parents were interested in having us educated. And so those schools served the purpose at the time. And I think it's important for people to know that history and know how the schools and the school systems have evolved.
Dr. Lester, do you have any questions?
Yes, you said you went away to college after you graduated from Crooms. Tell us where you went and what that experience was like.
Oh, it was my first time being away from home. I went to Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina. Now, how did I get there? My counselor at Crooms High School, Mrs. Douglas, knew that I was interested in pursuing music education. Miss Muller, who was my favorite teacher, and my music teacher at Oviedo at Jackson Heights Elementary was also my Sunday school teacher. And I loved Miss Muller, and I wanted to be just like Miss Muller. So if I was going to be like Mrs. Muller, I had to go to school and become a music teacher. So my high school counselor, Mrs. Douglas, who was the principal's wife, had a good friend who had graduated from Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina. So she encouraged me to apply to Livingstone among some other places. She knew that I was interested in getting out of the state of Florida because I had never been. So I applied and got a scholarship, and that's how I ended up at Livingstone College in Salisbury, North Carolina.
And what was that experience like?
It was a very good experience. Everything was new to me. I'd never experienced a library as big and beautiful and full of books as the library, Carnegie Library at Livingstone College. Because of course, when I graduated from high school, we could not go to the public library in Oviedo. As a matter of fact, I didn't even know where the public library in Oviedo was. There was no need to have that information because I couldn't go anyway. So the library was one of the first things that I noticed. And I went to the bookstore and I got all of these postcards with pictures of the library from different perspectives, from different vantage points, the inside, the outside, the books. And I wrote a little note on each one of those postcards and I sent them to Mrs. Muller. And I was so excited. And years later, I thought about how naive I was. And she probably chuckled when she got those postcards because to me, it was just another world being opened. But to her, it was probably no big deal. But I didn't know it at the time. It was wonderful being there from that perspective. It was also wonderful to meet kids from other states since I had not ever been out of the state of Florida. I had two roommates that first year. One was from Hollywood, Florida. The other was from Wilmington, North Carolina. Then we had two good friends who were in the dorm room next to us. One was from New York City and one was from Rock Hill, South Carolina. So all of us came from different backgrounds and it was just so wonderful to get close to people who had had different experiences, from this little girl who had been from such a small town where we didn't do much. We went to the movies maybe twice a month when the only theater was open for colored children and we only saw Westerns then, old Westerns at that. So just being in Salisbury and basically being on my own, to be able to go to the movies, to go shopping whenever I wanted to be able to go to restaurants. I had not ever eaten in a restaurant before going to college. We had ordered and taken things out, but never had the experience of actually sitting in a restaurant and ordering a meal. So everything was just totally different. It was a very good experience. And I will always remember that as a good experience.
Where did you do your doctoral work?
At Washington University in St. Louis. I got a master's at the American University in Washington, D.C. We lived there for a while because my husband was at the National Institutes of Health. So while he was there, I taught part-time and I was a substitute teacher. And then I got my master's at the American University. Then when we moved to St. Louis, because he had gone back to medical school and gotten an MD along with his PhD, he got an internship at Barnes Hospital, which is associated with Washington University in St. Louis. So I got a full-time teaching position and I went to school at night and earned a doctorate in music ed.
Where did you teach?
Where
did you teach?
In which state?
After you got your doctorate, where did you teach?
I continued to teach in the Florissant Ferguson School District in Missouri. And then we moved to Oklahoma City and I went back to school. School was always something that I did when we moved. I went back to school and became certified in administration, and so I became a principal in Oklahoma City. And I stayed a principal until I retired in 2009.
Is that when you came back to Oviedo?
No, we came back to Oviedo in 2019. We moved from Oklahoma to Washington, D.C. We were in Washington, D.C. twice and in Atlanta twice. When we left Washington, D.C. in 2001, we moved to Atlanta, which was a second time around for us because my first teaching position out of college was in Atlanta, Georgia, in the Fulton County school system. Now, how did I end up in Atlanta? Well, the guy that I was dating at Livingstone College went to Emory, which is in Atlanta, to do a PhD program. So he was 3 years ahead of me. So when I graduated, I applied for a teaching position in Atlanta so I could be close to him. So that's how we were there. And then once he got his degree, we moved to Missouri and then moved to Oklahoma, then back to DC. But I taught in all of those places. When we left DC in 2001, and moved to Atlanta. And we were there until 2019 when we moved back here permanently. Last move. My husband says the next move will be to the cemetery.
So is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would really like people to know about your growing up years or your college years? Or the changes that you've seen?
Well, one of the things that I would like for people to know, and it's come to the surface again, since we had this recent incident of hate where the building was vandalized by ugly symbols and ugly words, it brought back a memory that I don't talk about much. I mentioned that we were pretty sheltered growing up. Parents didn't share a lot of things with us, but they were always very careful with us. There was a reason why they wanted us to be home before dark, but we never knew what those reasons were until we left and came back and they would talk to us about it as adults. One of the reasons they wanted us to be home was because of night riders, KKK. They were very active, apparently, but we as children didn't know about it. We were just basically sheltered from that. Well, I went away to college. Well, let me back up. My father was killed when I was a senior in high school. May the 8th, 1965. He worked at Cape Canaveral. He carpooled with some other people. They would be let off at a point at the base where they basically had to walk maybe 3/4 of a mile to wherever they were going to be working that particular day. Well, on May the 8th, 1965, my father and a friend who lived across the street from us were walking to the point where they were to catch their ride. And 3 white men came along that they recognized from the Cape and offered them a ride, which they took. They were going to give them a ride, so they were told, according to Mr. Casey, who was my father's friend. they were going to give them a ride to where they were going to be picked up. Well, when they got there, they didn't stop. What they did was they took them into the woods, made them get out of the truck at gunpoint, and according to Mr. Case, my father said to him, I'm going to get one of them. And Case said, my father, no. And my father said, they're going to shoot us anyway. So he did. My father attacked one of them. Both of them got shot. Mr. Case survived. My father died on the way to the hospital. That was basically the first racially motivated incident that touched me and my family directly. Okay, fast forward, I go to college, I graduate from college, and I come back to visit my mother during the summer for a couple of weeks. I mentioned to you that Jackson Heights Elementary was across the street from where we grew up. Well, my mother continued to live in that house. During the renovations of the school and everything, it was updated. I was there. It was towards the end of the summer, and Jackson Heights was having open house. People were parked on the street and sort of off of the street onto my mother's property, which was sort of open. And there was this man sitting in a red pickup truck, throwing trash out of his window onto my mother's front yard, basically, because it's a big property and the street really ran through her property. So I went out to the truck and started picking up the trash and asked him to please stop throwing the trash in my mother's yard. Oh my goodness. Did he ever let me have it? He called me some of everything you could imagine and told me how his parents had owned blankety black slaves and blah, 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 blah. And basically, I just listened. And when he finished his rant, I said to him, have you always been this mean? Or is this just something you're saying to me? And he says to me, get away from my truck before I shoot you, and opened his glove compartment as if he was going to get something, but he didn't. And I said to him, I'm really not afraid of you. And he finished rolling up his window, and I just walked away. That was the second time that I was reminded of what's beneath the surface in this little town. Those are not happy memories, but those are things that stay with me no matter where I go or what I do. Now, one of my pleasant memories from college is that I met my husband, and we have been married almost 54 years. So,
Congratulations.
thank you. That's a good memory. He's a good man.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. We really do appreciate sharing your story.
Yes, sure, absolutely.
Excellent. Well, this has been Jeffrey Crivero with Dr. Connie Lester and Dr. Annie Gavin on January the 27th, 2025.
Well, thank you both.
Thank you.
I hope that wasn't